Welcome to Babel, Translating the Middle East, a podcast from the Middle East program at CSIS. Here on Babel, we take you beyond the headlines to take a closer look at what's happening in the Middle East and why it matters. This week on Babel, I speak with Hussein Ibish, a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. He's a columnist for The National and a regular contributor to The Atlantic. Together, we discuss popular mobilization across the Middle East since October 7th and what it tells us about regional politics. Then I continue the conversation with Natasha and Leah Hickert to discuss why some regimes choose to co-opt rather than suppress protest movements, and the ways in which the Arab world's protests over Gaza differ from those we've seen in the past. To translate some of what's happening in the Middle East, this is Babel. Hussein Ibish, welcome to Babel.
Thank you so much, John. It's a real honor to be here with you. Thank you.
On October 17th, protests swept the Arab world after accusations that Israel had bombed the Ahli Baptist Hospital in Gaza. But rather than grow, all of those protests seem to level off. Why is the Arab street not in open revolt about Gaza?
Well, because there is no Arab street. It's a term that should be retired. It should never have been imported from French into English and then into the Arab world. There is no Arab street. There is Arab public opinions, and there's 24 national subsets within a huge kaleidoscope of subnational subsets based on differences of class and ethnicity, tribe, clan. All of these differences make for a really complicated socio-political scene in the Arab world. And I think a lot of people, beginning with the birth of Arab nationalism, which was kind of, an importation of a European model of post-Westphalian nation statehood, especially 19th century ethno-cultural nationalism that kind of dominated Europe, not really suited to a post-Ottoman Middle East, frankly. Within these structures, you have a myriad of different national and subnational identifications, right? And so there was this expectation during the period of Arab nationalism, during the Nasser era and after that, that all the Arabs were prototype Arab nationalists, and all they needed was the chance to demonstrate their pan-Arab nationalism, and they would unify, and they would love it. So people expected unity out of Nasserite Arab nationalism. They didn't get it. Then they expected Islamism to at least take over in the Arab republics after the fall of dictators during the Arab Spring. The Muslim Brothers expected it, the Qataris expected it, and the Turks. I think a lot of people on the left and the right in the West expected it as well, because most Arabs are devout Muslims, so they thought they were proto-Islamists, right? Turns out not at all, because they are competing values. And so I just think the Arab political culture is a lot more variegated and complex than people say.
But certainly the Palestinian cause was something that people cared about, that would get people on the street.
Now, yes. Does the Palestinian cause stir heartstrings? It does. Did it then? Yes. It did from its very outset. And it has always stirred heartstrings, and I'm sure it always will. It is unreasonable to expect Arabs to undo their domestic societies because a subset of Palestinians are being brutalized by Israel because of an action taken by Hamas. That's very important, right? If it happened absent October 7, it would have been very different. But I think people have a lot of hesitations about Hamas. I also want to point out that Gaza is not a place that resonates with a lot of people in the Arab or broader Muslim world. It commands a lot of attention among Palestinians, a lot of Israelis, and some Egyptians. That's it. But I mean, just generally, it doesn't have a lot of resonance the way, say, East Jerusalem would have. If Al-Aqsa Mosque had been involved in this, or even any part of occupied East Jerusalem, that stirs heartstrings, right? But Gaza doesn't. So I think it's very important to understand people have their doubts about Hamas, and to them, Gaza is sort of like, where exactly is this? And while there's a lot of anger, who to aim it at is not clear. So when you're demonstrating in, say, Morocco or Saudi Arabia or Iraq ultimately, if you're sensible, you know you're demonstrating largely against the local forces. Because why would the Israelis care if somebody's demonstrating in Morocco or Saudi Arabia? And so that's another problem. Like, how does that help Palestinians?
And so on that point, I mean, one of the explanations for why there aren't more protests in the Arab world is because Arab governments fear that if there were protests, they would rapidly turn into anti-local government protests. And having learned the lessons from the Arab Spring, they don't want to open that door. There's another argument, which is that people are principally concerned with their daily lives, that Palestine preoccupied an earlier generation that was looking for an issue to unite around. But for this generation, they're interested in jobs, they're interested in getting married, they're interested in consumer culture.
No, I think there's a lot of truth to the second one. The first one is manifestly wrong for a couple of reasons. First, because you have not seen an effort by Arab governments to suppress nascent demonstrations, to show people a whiff of grape shot, to scare them back into their homes. Really haven't seen that. I think it served some of the regimes. Take the Sisi regime in Egypt, which is a really repressive government. Their reaction to anti-Israel, pro-Hamas, whatever it is, anti-war protests in Egypt was not to say you mustn't, but to say, great idea, go do it next to the pyramids. In other words, in the middle of nowhere where it wouldn't matter. Now, that didn't work, so they had to allow people to do it a bit in Cairo. But by allowing the protests without trying to suppress them in a violent way, right, or in a mass incarceratory way, what they've done is they've let off some steam. There are two kinds of Arab societies where you've seen major public expressions of disruptive and unruly outrage. The first are places with a lot of Iranian influence, places where organizations connected to Iran's so-called axis of resistance, of which Hamas is kind of a junior member in bad standing, but is still a member, you know, that they can get people out in Beirut, and people can be got out in Tehran, and people can be got out in Iraq. And then you've seen them where there are lots of Palestinians. But the place that really got threatened, the place where the government was actually worried, was Jordan. Because Jordan had the most passionate, most unruly, least controlled demonstrations. Jordan is the place where these demonstrations hint at or point towards a very different kind of domestic political arrangement. And under such circumstances, the Jordanian regime had to tread very carefully between allowing protests and suppressing protests. And they decided to go with allowing them and hoping they would peter out. And they sort of have, but they have been destabilizing to state and society. And they brought to the fore the uneasy social contract between Jordanians who support the Hashemite monarchy and Palestinian Jordanians who are something like half of the population, maybe even more. And it's post-Black September, when in 1969, 1970, the most extreme wings of the PLO, with the PFLP, took over some parts of Jordan and turned them into a de facto Palestinian state for the purpose of waging guerrilla war against Israel. In Amman, there was a war, and the Palestinian national movement was driven to court from Jordan into Lebanon. Since then, the basic social contract has been, you can live here as citizens, you can do anything you like, but don't pursue your national aspirations in Jordan. Pursue them in Palestine. And do it in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Israel, somewhere else, just not here, okay? This conflict brings to the fore the fact that the worse things get between Israelis and Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, the more the likelihood is that there'll be large numbers of Palestinians ending up additionally in Jordan from the West Bank, driven out or fleeing conflict or something, as Israel ends up annexing chunks of the West Bank.
And of course, most Palestinians in the West Bank have Jordanian citizenship, so they have that ability.
They can renew their Jordanians. So they can call back their Jordanians. Yeah, there's a real issue there. In addition to which, there's been this Israeli mantra for many, many decades that Jordan is Palestine. And the Jordanians fear that that could become true if the Palestinians cannot pursue self-determination in mandatory Palestine.
Let me go back to, in many ways, your first answer about the nature of protests in the Arab world and this idea of voice. As you know, Mark Lynch wrote a book in 2007 called Voices of the New Arab Public. It feels to me like after 2011 and the Arab Spring uprisings, that maybe there was some learned helplessness and Arab publics decided, actually, a lot of these issues are the ambit of governments and not really for the public to challenge. Are you seeing some of that at play here as people talk about Gaza?
I think that's true. I think we saw when dictators fell what uncontrolled bottom-up change can look like. And it didn't look good anywhere. Even Tunisia has gone backwards majorly. Everywhere. The whole democratization program has been a failure for now. None of the essential grievances of the Arab Spring have been resolved in any way. So I fully expect all of those issues to come back at some point, and probably with a vengeance. But I think there is, you could call it learned helplessness, or you could call it acquired wisdom. Either way. The idea that uncontrolled bottom-up change is a good idea and that will work out well is a discredited one. And similarly to the way the Muslim Brotherhood Project became discredited over the same period of time for many of the same reasons, because most Arabs don't want it and they won't put up with it if you try to shove it down their throat. They'd rather stick with the old regimes that have better lives. So I do think there is a sense that the chaos version of change is not popular either. At the same time, you have a great surge of nationalism, right? There was a competing value when the Islamists were fighting for power during the Arab Spring decade of 2011 to sort of 2019 or so, which was that even though the brothers had the Quran, other people had the flag. And the flag was at least as powerful as the Quran. And some of the people with the flag could grab the Quran and pull it back, like happened in Libya, and say, hey, no, I know this book as well as you do. Don't tell me I'm not as good a Muslim as you are just because I'm not a fundamentalist. Get lost. And besides, you're a traitor, which is maybe a worse term than an apostate, frankly, in a lot of these countries. And you've seen a surge, for example, in the Gulf. A country like Saudi Arabia has undergone a complete transformation of its government legitimation narrative. It used to be heavily based on the Islamic heritage of Saudi Arabia. And now it's partly that, but more the kind of history of power and authority and military conquest of the Saud family, representing Saudi national interests going all the way back to the 18th century, but before Abdul Wahab. So the originary story of the modern Saudi state is no longer said to be in the pact between the Sauds and Hamad ibn Abdul Wahab. It's now dated to an earlier Saudi conquest and the military prowess of and authority of the Sauds as a ruling family. And you see this all over. So you've got a Saudi first agenda. You've got an Emirati first agenda, where there's been a huge emphasis in the past 10 years in the UAE on national service and other programs designed to take these 7 emirates and make people believe they are UAE citizens and not people from Ras Al Khaimah or Abu Dhabi or Dubai or Sharjah. No, you're an Emirati first. There's something similar in Qatar as well, especially due to the boycott. All over the Arab world, there was a resurgence of patriotism as part of a backlash to the Islamist moment, which fizzled. But it's not pan-Arab nationalism, it's domestic nationalism. It's state-specific nationalism, right? And that's one thing that Arab societies that remain functional are trying to foster as a bulwark against the state failure of a lot of the republics like Iraq and Lebanon, Syria, Libya, etc. The idea is not enough just to have a monarchy. You need to also have a patriotic citizenry. That conflates the two, of course.
And so does Gaza consolidate that inflection point that, as I understand it, you felt was really captured by the Arab Spring? Is there a way in which Gaza consolidates it? Does it move it? Is Gaza part of a new kind of Arab politics? Does it accelerate a new kind of Arab politics?
That's TBD, right? If the war ends soon, then I think it's likely we'll look back on this as an inflection point that consolidates the new nationalism, the new domestic nationalism and the death for now of Islamist projects in the Arab world, because one of the things holding people back from embracing everything about the Gaza war is they don't want to help Hamas. And it's not just true of governments, it's true of people. And October 7 was not designed to make them love Hamas if they didn't like them in the first place. But more to the point, none of it really felt like a great idea in a lot of the rest of the Arab world in theory. So that does hold people back. However, Hamas knew they were going to be sacrificing what they had built in Gaza and throwing over the apple cart, embracing what they said they wanted, which was a state of permanent war with Israel, an open-ended insurgency. And I wrote this back on like December 12th or something in the Atlantic. I said, this is a trap. Israel's walking into a trap. But what I meant was that the Israelis were being lured in to a first phase where they would do what they did from north to south, ending at Rafah, right? But then they wouldn't go. As long as they're there, it gives Hamas the opportunity to have the war they want. The war they want is an open-ended insurgency against Israeli forces that will give them every week, if not every day, a bloody shirt they can wave in front of the other Palestinians and say, we are the national movement. We are the only ones who are fighting and dying for control of Palestinian land here in Gaza against the Israeli occupiers. Look at those idiots in the West Bank. What are they doing? They're the gendarmerie of the occupation, and the PLO sits at an empty negotiating table where no good can come of it. And we are the leaders, so we should take over the PLO and be there in the UN and what have you. And they're playing a long game. They're thinking in terms of 10, 15 years, and they're thinking in terms of Palestinian politics. So this is very consequential. If the Israelis stay in Gaza and they provide Hamas with the insurgency, the open-ended insurgency they want, which will immediately become a quagmire for Israel because it will lack a goal. It will lack a strategy. It will just be a self-reinforcing whack-a-mole, right? You see that in every counterinsurgency that's open-ended. Unless you build up a political alternative, which would mean doing that while building up the PA in the West Bank. But the Israelis want none of that at this point anyway. But if it just continues the way it is, as Netanyahu seems to want, this could be the beginning of an Islamist resurgence led by Hamas. That is not impossible. At the moment, the Arab reaction to the war in Gaza is held back by the fact that it's being led by Hamas. But over a 5, 7, 8-year period, you could see that pendulum swing completely, where Hamas becomes the vanguard, not just of the Palestinian national movement, but of Arab sentiments in general, and the revival of an Islamist trend. I find that entirely plausible. It's one of the many of the worst of the parade of horribles that proceeds from Netanyahu's policy of generally making this into the war that Sinwar wants.
How do you think Hamas is doing on the information warfare piece? How do you see it? What do you think its principal instruments are, its principal storylines? It's
statements that its very effective spokespeople make on Telegram and Signal and other social media, and sometimes even on news. It's the spin that is given by its diplomats in Qatar, who used to pretend to be their political leaders, but never were, and now it's official that Sinwar is in charge. And the fact that Israel's propaganda is so bad, Israel's ability to explain what the hell they're doing has been so poor because they haven't known. The biggest bolster for Hamas's line here is the way Israel has conducted the war, which has been a war of vengeance, right? On October 7, Netanyahu got on Israeli TV and promised a mighty vengeance. That's a direct quote. And that's exactly what's happened in Gaza. Nothing else has been accomplished, to my mind, except a mighty vengeance. The whole society has suffered to the point of Gaza delenda est. This is how I see it. And a lot of the Arab world sees it that way. Other people don't. I think it's kind of obvious. Under such circumstances, people are genuinely outraged. So, first of all, Israel's own behavior is Hamas's best communications victory. The second thing is that Israel has not been able to articulate why it's doing what it's doing, except in its own context. Among Jewish Israelis, and I think even other Israelis, it works okay, because people feel threatened, so vengeance, war, but it all sounds good. To the rest of the world, it just looks like a rampage. I think to a large extent because it was a rampage. And under such circumstances, all Hamas has to do is to say, we're surviving, we're here, and here are the number of people who died. And here is what they did today. And here is what we suffered today. And Israel is still stuck maybe on October 8 or 9 or 10, right? They're still maybe emotionally transfixed in the horror of October 7. And that's understandable for Israeli society. But the rest of the world, no. So for Hamas, I think it's been really helpful. On the other hand, October 7 sentences Hamas to be a non-player for the foreseeable future in Palestinian national representation. There is no way that Hamas can become a respectable interlocutor. They have made themselves, it's true, the de facto Palestinian interlocutor on matters of war and peace. But that's mainly because of the extent to which Israel has marginalized and belittled the PA and the PLO in the West Bank. It's not so much a victory of Hamas, it's walking into a vacuum. And I think it would not be that difficult to create a plausible Palestinian alternative to Hamas just by rebuilding Fatah and the PA, which you can do with incentives and with money and with support and with a series of measures, a series of benchmarks that if the PA meets, then they get this much more power and this much more independence and this much more money. That's absolutely never been tried. And maybe the death of Abbas might be an opportunity to try to do it. I mean, he is sort of the living embodiment of the condition of Fatah,
88 with a smoking habit.
Yeah, 88 with a smoking habit, and kind of like, you wonder what kind of batteries behind there. But yeah, it's pretty bad. But you still got an opportunity, in my view, to take the Gaza war and October 7 and use it to create something better among Palestinians. But you have to be willing to do it. If you keep backhanding the PA and refusing to give them their own money and sicking settlers on everybody like the Ku Klux Klan Night Riders, it's not going to work.
But the other piece of this is, in many ways, you said that Hamas has not been skillful.
Well, they haven't needed to be, is my point. I mean, I think they have been kind of skillful in terms of messaging to the Arab world.
But as you point out, you're not really getting large people in the street. You're not affecting public policy.
Correct.
Your argument
is... the biggest thing is that it was a complete shot in the dark, but they were hoping that October 7 would spark a regional war against Israel, and that Hezbollah and Iran and the Hashd al-Sha'bi groups and Houthis would all run to their defense, as they thought they had been promised, or as they hoped they had been promised in Beirut last summer. And that didn't happen. And so that's the biggest letdown, in a sense. And what they would be looking for is unrest in these countries, pushing those groups and societies towards more conflict. But I think you see the opposite. In Lebanon, you don't see any appetite for a war, including among the Shiites of southern Lebanon. There's just nobody pushing for Hezbollah to have a war with Israel under current circumstances, not at all.
I've known you for about 15 years, maybe a little more. I know your thinking on Palestine has evolved a lot over that period of time. Where do you see the Palestine issue going over the next 5 to 10 years? And I'm not saying a single scenario, but give me a sense for what you think some different scenarios might be.
I think there are only two likely scenarios, maybe three. One is the main one. I have been saying since the failure of the Camp David summit in 2000, and I think it's becoming more and more true with every year, that we have been on a very slow train that's becoming a fast train and could become a bullet train soon, on the way to a station called annexation/expulsion. There is a clear intent on the part of a lot of people in Israel with power to annex big chunks of the West Bank, the Jordan Valley, everything behind the settlement barrier, everywhere there's a major Jewish settlement and beyond. And this has gone from being a fantasy of extremists to being a de facto policy of the current coalition and a plausible scenario. And the way it would happen, you can see easily how it would happen. There would be an explosion of violence in the West Bank. It seemed like out of control. And the Israelis would say, right, this is too much. We can't take it anymore. We need a divorce. We've got to separate the two peoples in their interests and ours. This is the last thing we want to do. With a heavy heart, with tears rolling down our cheeks, we will do this thing. And we're going to annex this area. And whoops, a lot of people ended up on the other side. Well, just going to stay there. And this is good for everybody. And we would never have wanted to do this, but we have to. And I think that's a very likely scenario in the long run, because I just don't see how the Israelis square the circle otherwise. And I don't see them as being willing to give up this land, the land that is more important to many Israelis than most of Israel. If you look at this from a religious or even a historical irredentist perspective, you want the West Bank more than you want those areas. And, having got it and having held it for so long, you're just going to give it back because you lost the debate in a moral universe, because it's right to do it, or because the UN Charter demands it. My fear is the Israeli-Palestinian relationship has degenerated to the point. This is where we are. I think enough Israelis have decided they prefer annexation to any other scenario. There's nothing stopping them. I think that's likely to happen. On the other hand, you could have an epiphany.
It's the right neighborhood to have an epiphany.
It's certainly, well, I'm kind of anti-epiphany. I'm a great agnostic. Anyway, back on planet Earth, there could still be this moment of recognition in Israel that they have two choices. And right now, they could recognize the Palestinian right to a state and undertake to some point get into negotiations to eventually create one and end the Gaza war. That would be enough to get a deal with Saudi Arabia and the US and really consolidate Israel's security. It would be the beginning of a new relationship with the Palestinians based on propping up the Palestinians who want to talk to Israel rather than the Palestinians who want to kill Israelis. Or you can just kick back and wait for the war to get worse and worse, which is what ultimately would happen. But this annexation expulsion scenario is so beguiling because it has the appearance of a solution, which of course it wouldn't be. It would be a catastrophe beyond imagining, but it looks like a potential solution. And that's what makes it such a siren song. The third scenario is that none of that could happen and everything limp along in the status quo. And this status quo includes a whack-a-mole insurgency, counterinsurgency in Gaza. And under such circumstances, I can see the potential for Hamas to become the leader of the Palestinian National Movement, which would functionally kill it at the international level under current circumstances. And I don't think that's terribly likely, but the sort of stumbling along is possible. In other words, the three scenarios are you could try to eliminate the Palestinian question altogether, right, through annexation and expulsion, or you can build up an alternative to Hamas, or you could continue dealing with Hamas and whoever in the West Bank and just basically stumble forward blindly. And I do think in Israel, blind is a good word. It's been acting like a giant with a club, waving it around with great smashing capability, but with no vision at all.
Hussein Ibish, thank you for joining us on Babel.
You've been very welcome. Thank you so much, Jon. It's an honor.
Dr. Ibish argued that regimes often try to co-opt rather than suppress protest movements. Where else have you seen this, and how has it changed since the Arab Spring protests of 2011?
It's remarkable how many places I've seen it happen, that there's sort of a loyal opposition that a lot of these governments want. There are benefits from being in the loyal opposition. There are huge price to be paid for being in the disloyal opposition. And I think there are a lot of people, and I've seen it in Egypt, I've seen it in Saudi Arabia, I've seen it in Iraq, I've seen it in Libya, that there is space to be critical and argue for evolutionary change. And if you want to argue for revolutionary change, you're going to have a problem. Now, a lot of people have been arguing for the same evolutionary change for 30 or 40 years. I think they get burned out. But I think after the Arab Spring, for so many people, revolutionary change turned out so poorly. I know people whose lives were destroyed, that the appetite for revolutionary change, it feels to me, has really diminished in many places. And there is a sense that evolutionary change is not only desirable, but maybe the best that people can hope for.
I would say on the flip of that, there's two things. One, it's incredible to me that people still protest in the Arab world. We saw it in 2019. People are still protesting in Syria occasionally and getting shot down predictably. But also, I think after the Arab Spring, the appetite amongst regimes for even that sort of allowed dissent of previous years, or even protests on Palestine, for example, is gone. There is very, very little appetite to allow for gatherings of any kind unless they are in adamant support of the regime, because these governments know that any gathering of people could quickly turn against them. And as a result, they've grown very, very skilled at oppressing these movements, at nipping them in the bud before they even begin. And this is certainly the case that we've seen in Egypt and Jordan in the months after October 7th, where hundreds of people were arrested, but people were also taken in based off of what they were posting online. And I think Arab states have always had particularly good oppressive apparatuses, but I think that they've really enhanced that skill set since the Arab Spring out of the need to survive, frankly.
It does strike me they have allowed some protests. We certainly have seen some protests in Egypt and Jordan and elsewhere, but I think you're right that there's a protest. But if you want to do the belt and suspenders approach, right, it's not just about we're limiting the size of the protests, but surveillance of the protests includes electronic surveillance of people. The idea of being a leader of a movement, the idea of a movement that is not in coordination with the government, I think is something the governments have much less appetite for. In many ways, in the Gulf, you never saw public protests. You still don't see public protests. But this sense of an aversion to an independent movement, I think that aversion is much more acute in the Levant and in North Africa than it was 13 years ago.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we should also say that there is always a danger if a protest happens that security forces that are supposed to put them down or at least block the way for Jordanian protesters, for example, who tried to get through the cordon on the Israeli embassy early on and burn down the embassy, that those security forces will side with the protesters eventually. I mean, I saw videos in Jordan of people protesting and security forces saying, "We're with you on this." So I think that that threat also somewhat remains. So I think getting people away from any kind of protest site, away from any squares, is really optimal to even having to suppress these, because they know that that kind of oppression could also create its own momentum as well.
What is different about the Arab world's protests over Gaza compared to what you've both seen in the past?
I would say in the past, regimes have been able to co-opt pro-Palestinian protests.
Or actually encourage them.
Or encourage them, because it was a way to distract away from their own governance failures, from the economy, from their own oppressive tactics. Today, a lot more Arab states have normalized with Israel, or in some way, shape, or form. And so they know that pro-Palestinian protests could turn on them quite easily. Egypt and Jordan have known this for some time. And I think that there was even expressions to the protesters that if you're going to carry a Palestinian flag, you have to carry a Jordanian flag at the same time. And with Egypt, a lot of the protests were about closing the Rafah border crossing into Gaza. So, some of these were integrally related to the regime itself. And you actually saw a lot of the protest movements attacking the kingdom, the Hashemite monarchy, which is quite rare in Jordan, especially with regards to pro-Palestinian protests. So they need to be very careful now. And that's the biggest change I've seen. And you hear it over and over again from government officials that it's my guy's head on the line when it comes to these kinds of protests, when it comes to Palestine, because they've normalized relations. They've put themselves out there.
It also feels to me a little less passionate on the political side, a little more passionate on the human side. There's something about the way people experience what's happening to Gazans through Al Jazeera, watching sort of curated endless loops of pictures, through social media, through, frankly, disinformation that's circulating on social media. But there is this way in which people both feel more personal, but also feel less political about it, that there's less of a connection to government action, maybe for some of the reasons Natasha talks about, and more maybe personal. We've seen really robust, privately driven boycott movements of not only Israeli companies, American companies. And it does feel to me like the tenor is different. It's not demanding the governments do stuff, but as a person, this offends me, and this is how I'm going to live my life.
I think that's absolutely right. I see less of the sort of the pro-Palestinian side of things, where I think a lot of people realize that governments in general use these movements to their liking.
And certainly there's no Palestinian government that people want to support. They don't want to support Hamas. They don't want to support Mahmoud Abbas. There is no Yasser Arafat to be the object of veneration.
But there is this sense of dehumanization, which I think is very human. And I don't think that, frankly, the U.S. administration, the Biden administration, has been great at humanizing Palestinians. I think Kamala Harris is trying to. But I do think that there's this very human element to what's happening in Gaza and sort of the imbalance between the reaction to Ukraine, for example, and what's happening, I think, in Gaza and the West Bank.
Jon, you mentioned disinformation. Why haven't rampant efforts to push out disinformation about Gaza precipitated a more extremist response?
It's interesting because we had extremist groups doing a lot of very effective work on social media after 9/11, recruiting people. They certainly were able to recruit extremists to Syria. I think part of the reason is you have a much more skeptical public. I think part of the reason is also you have much more effective government surveillance of social media messaging, those kinds of things. And I think governments are trying to be more disruptive. I could imagine that some extremist groups might get a little luckier than they've been so far. But it does feel to me like there's almost a sort of nihilism, that there's not a lot of support for Hamas in the Arab world, as Hussein Ibish said, except for the idea that, well, at least they're fighting. But the ideology isn't really attractive to a lot of people. I think there's a way in which they're not broadly popular, but for the most part, it feels to me like not only Arab governments, but the United States and other Western governments have sort of disrupted the cycle. They put a lot of effort into understanding how this cycle of radicalization works through social media. And it does feel to me like part of this, as Natasha was saying earlier in response to the protest, partly governments are intervening, they're disrupting in a way that they weren't 10 or 15 years ago, partly with the assistance, cooperation, and encouragement of the United States.
So I think in terms of U.S. adversaries in the region, I'm not sure there needs to be a lot of disinformation with this when it comes to China or Russia as well. They see what's going on. We're seeing what's going on in real time in Gaza. We're seeing the press statements out of the DOD and the White House. I think Iran and others see this, and they think the U.S. is sort of actively digging their own hole, and Israel as well, with their own statements from far-right politicians. So I'm not sure how much disinformation is needed on that side. But certainly, I think in any of these contexts, disinformation truly has the power to create additional instability and really make us not focus on the problem at hand. And I saw that in Syria quite a bit. So we do need to be careful about this new world because there's just more players in the disinformation space. People and governments are using artificial intelligence to enhance those capabilities as well. They're also using it to combat disinformation. But I think we're in a very different world where really any kind of spark could create additional escalation. And so I think we need to be very careful about that information space.
Thank you for joining me, Jon and Natasha.
Thank you, Leah.
Thanks, Leah.
Thanks for listening to Babel. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find more analysis on this topic linked in the show notes on the CSIS website, and you can find us on Twitter at CSIS Mideast.